Set the glass down. I'll walk out on my own. Don't make a scene. You've been living off my success for 7 years, and I'm done carrying you.
Listen to her, mate. Security's on their way. This room is for people who've actually built something. You don't belong here.
You really think I don't belong in this room?
Leave before they throw you out into the street where you belong.
Then you should know. I own this entire building.
The security guard was polite about it. That was the part I remembered most clearly afterward. Not the words my wife had spoken into the microphone. Not the sound of 300 people going quiet all at once. Not the way Damien stood beside her with the particular ease of a man who had rehearsed the moment. What I remembered was the guard's expression. Apologetic. Careful. The expression of a man doing something uncomfortable that he had been told was necessary. He extended one hand slightly in my direction, and I looked at it for a moment before setting my glass of sparkling water on the nearest table. I straightened my jacket. I walked toward the exit without looking back. What no one in that ballroom knew, not my wife Serena, not Marcus Hale standing at her shoulder with his hand resting at the small of her back, not a single person holding a champagne flute and watching me leave with the quiet satisfaction of people witnessing a scene they will discuss for weeks, was that the building we were standing in belonged to me. Not in the loose sense of equity or silent investment. In the direct, documented, legally unambiguous sense. Carvel Group had been incorporated under my family's holding structure for 11 years. The gala celebrating its decade of success was being held inside a venue I had purchased 8 years prior. The man who had just had me removed was a vice president I had approved hiring 18 months ago without ever introducing myself. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. I just hadn't expected it to cost me quite this much. To understand why I said nothing, you have to understand what I had learned about silence. Not the silence of weakness, not the silence of a man who had nothing to say, but the particular silence of someone who had made a decision years ago and had spent every year since living inside its consequences. I had met Serena at a small gallery opening on the east side of the city 7 years before that night. She was standing in front of a large, abstract canvas with a half-finished glass of red wine, and she was arguing, quietly but firmly, with a gallery assistant about the lighting arrangement. She believed the piece was being shown to its worst advantage. She was right. I listened to her make the argument for 3 minutes before I agreed with her, and she turned and looked at me with the expression of someone who had been expecting to be dismissed and wasn't quite sure what to do with agreement. We had dinner 2 nights later at a place she chose. Small, crowded, the kind of restaurant that doesn't take reservations and doesn't need to. She talked about her work, brand strategy for mid-sized companies trying to grow without losing their identity, and I listened the way I always listened, carefully, without performing attention. She told me later that was the thing that had surprised her most about that first evening. She had expected someone who nodded in the right places. She got someone who actually heard what she said. I was living simply then, deliberately simply. The apartment was comfortable but unremarkable. The car reliable but not impressive. The wardrobe functional and nothing more. I had made that choice 8 years before I met Serena, after a period that had clarified something I could not unlearn once I understood it. Her name had been Claire. We had been together for 4 years, and I had believed, with the full and uncomplicated certainty of a man who has not yet been proven wrong about something important, that she was there because of who I was. A restructuring in one of the holding companies produced a difficult quarter, and the news, though temporary and ultimately inconsequential, moved through certain professional circles faster than I anticipated. Claire was gone within 3 weeks. Not dramatically, not with an argument. She simply stopped being present and then stopped returning calls, and eventually I understood that the relationship had been predicated on an assumption about my future that a difficult quarter had disrupted enough to make her recalibrate. I didn't become bitter. Bitterness would have been easier, cleaner, a feeling I could have named and eventually put down. What I became instead was careful. I stripped everything visible away and decided that the next person who chose me would choose me without the weight of what came with me. It was, I understood even at the time, a strategy built on fear. But it was also the only way I knew to be certain. Serena never asked about money. That was the first thing I noticed. She was curious about ideas, about problems worth solving, about what a person found meaningful at the end of a day. She had no patience for performance, and no interest in what a man drove or where he had last traveled. She found that kind of conversation wasteful, and she said so, which made me trust her in a way I hadn't trusted anyone in years. We were married 18 months after the gallery. Quiet ceremony, 40 guests, a restaurant she loved in the neighborhood where she had grown up. Her parents were warm and straightforward people who had built a comfortable life through consistent work and treated me accordingly. Her father shook my hand at the reception and told me that Serena was not an easy person to be married to, but that she was worth every difficulty. I told him I didn't find her difficult at all. He laughed and said I would. The first 3 years were genuinely good. She was sharp and demanding in the way that people are when they hold themselves to high standards and expect the same from others, and I respected that. We argued about real things, ideas and priorities and how to spend a Sunday, not about the hollow frustrations that accumulate between people who have stopped seeing each other. She laughed often, and without self-consciousness. She called me out when I retreated into myself too far, and didn't stop until I came back. I came home every evening to someone who was actually interested in whether the day had been worth having. The thing about slow change is that it looks like nothing for a long time. You don't notice the temperature dropping until you are already cold. Marcus Hale arrived at Carvel Group in the spring of the 4th year. He came in as a senior growth strategist, and he arrived the way men like him always arrived, with momentum, with confidence, with the particular energy of someone who has spent years learning how to enter a room and immediately become its center of gravity. His background was impressive on paper and more impressive in person. He spoke about markets with genuine fluency and about relationships with practiced warmth. And within 6 weeks of joining the company, he had reorganized his entire social landscape to include the people who mattered most to its future. Serena's firm handled communications for 3 of Carvel Group's subsidiary brands. That was how they met. Professional at first, then friendly in the way that professional becomes friendly when 2 people discover they think about the same things and find each other good company for the thinking. She mentioned him casually at dinner one evening, a conversation about a campaign brief that had gone well, something he had said that she found interesting. I noted it and said nothing. Over the following weeks, the mentions continued. Not excessively, not in a way that anyone could have pointed to as a signal, but I had been watching people carefully for most of my adult life, and what I heard underneath the words was a shift in register, a quality of attention that people reserve for things that have started to matter to them. I told myself it was professional admiration. I told myself the adjustment period in any marriage included seasons of distance, and that this was simply one of them. I told myself many things that were partially true and therefore easy to believe. What I didn't tell myself was that I had noticed Serena's phone screen light up with a name saved simply as M, and that she had taken the call in the hallway rather than the kitchen, which was where she always took calls. Some knowledge arrives quietly. You can choose to look at it directly, or you can let it sit at the edge of your vision until you are ready. I let it sit. I watched. I waited. By the time the gala was 3 months away, I had stopped waiting. I called Daniel Marsh on a Tuesday morning in January. Daniel had been my attorney for 13 years, and there was no version of my situation he hadn't seen or handled with the precise, unhurried competence that made him the only person I trusted with the full architecture of what I had built. When I told him I needed a quiet investigation, he asked no questions. He said he would begin immediately. What he found in the weeks that followed was not a surprise, but it was thorough enough to be undeniable. Marcus Hale had joined Carvel Group not through the conventional recruitment process, but through a referral structure that, when traced back through 3 intermediary steps, connected to a private equity group that had been making discreet inquiries about Carvel Group's data infrastructure division for the better part of 2 years. The inquiries had been deflected each time through the standard channels. What Marcus represented was a different approach, a closer one. The financial irregularities were subtler than the ones Daniel had encountered before, but they were there. Budget approvals that had been processed at one figure and disbursed at another. Consulting invoices from an entity that had no registered employees and no verifiable history of any client beyond Carvel Group. The amounts were not enormous by the standards of what the company moved, but they were consistent, and they were directional, and they told a story that Daniel summarized in a single sentence during our second call. He said the money was being redirected toward a position, and that position was being built toward something. I told Daniel to document everything and wait. He asked me how long. I told him until after the gala. He was quiet for a moment before he said he understood, in the tone of a man who understands but reserves the right to disagree. There was one more thing. Daniel had spoken to Evelyn, who had been my executive director at the holding company for 9 years, and who kept records with the thoroughness of someone who understood that documents are the only things that cannot be argued with. Evelyn had flagged a communication. An email between Marcus and an external contact, sent 3 weeks earlier from a personal account that had been inadvertently routed through a shared server during a system migration. The content was professionally worded, but its meaning was plain. It referenced the gala as a timeline marker. It referenced a transfer of operational authority. It referenced Serena by name, not in the context of her firm's communications work, but in the context of what she could facilitate once certain arrangements were finalized. I read that email twice in Daniel's office, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the city moving quietly 12 floors below. Then I folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of my jacket and walked back out into the street. I had stopped being angry somewhere in the weeks of accumulating evidence. What had replaced the anger was something I found harder to describe. A kind of sad, clean clarity, the way air feels after a long rain. I understood the shape of what had happened. I understood the timeline. What I needed now was the room, the event, the moment when everything Marcus had been quietly constructing would either complete itself or be interrupted. And I needed to see, in that moment, what Serena would choose to do. I already suspected I knew. I simply wasn't ready to be certain. The Aldrin Terrace was a venue I had purchased on the recommendation of a property advisor 8 years prior. It occupied the top 3 floors of a converted industrial building in the financial district. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides, a rooftop terrace that could accommodate 300 guests, and an interior that had been redesigned with the specific aesthetic of a company trying to signal that it had arrived. I had attended the renovation review. I had approved the final design. I had never mentioned any of this to anyone at Carvel Group, because that was how the holding structure worked, and how I had always wanted it to work. I arrived at the gala in a plain charcoal suit. I had considered wearing something different and then decided against it. I wasn't there to announce anything. I was there to see. The room was full when I entered. 300 people in formal wear moving through the kind of carefully curated space that announces its own importance before anyone in it has said a word. I recognized faces throughout the room, board members, department heads, clients, people whose decisions I had influenced in one way or another from a distance they were entirely unaware of. Several of them had met me over the years in various capacities without connecting those meetings to anything larger. I had always kept the introductions partial. It was the arrangement. Serena was near the center of the room when I found her. She was in a blue dress I hadn't seen before, and she was standing beside Marcus with the ease of 2 people who had stopped managing how they appeared together. I watched her for a moment from across the room. She looked animated, engaged, in the particular way she looked when she was around something that interested her. She had looked that way when we first met, when the world was still something she was discovering rather than navigating. I moved toward her, not to confront, simply to be present, to stand in the same room and see what she would do. She saw me from 15 feet away, and something passed across her face that I could not cleanly name. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to the expression of someone who had been managing 2 separate realities and had just found them occupying the same space. She said my name in a tone that was designed to sound welcoming and landed as something else entirely. She asked what I was doing in this part of the room, and the way she asked it, the slight edge beneath the casualness, told me that she had already drawn a boundary around where I was expected to be, and I had crossed it without knowing. Marcus looked at me briefly and returned his attention to his drink with the practiced disinterest of a man communicating hierarchy through selective notice. I said I had simply come to see her. She smiled in the way that is meant to close a conversation, and then someone she knew appeared from a nearby table, and she turned her attention there, and I was, without drama or declaration, no longer part of the moment. I returned to a position near the far wall and watched. What happened next happened faster than I had anticipated. 40 minutes into the evening, before the formal program had begun, before the remarks from the company's executives or the acknowledgement of the milestone being celebrated, Serena walked to the stage. She did not wait to be introduced. She took the microphone with the confidence of someone who has already decided how the evening ends, and she smiled at the room in the way she had always smiled in professional settings, openly, warmly, with the particular authority of a woman who has spent years learning how to command attention without appearing to demand it. She said she had something she wanted the room to know. The ambient conversation dropped away. 300 people turned to find the voice. She said our marriage was over. She said it clearly and without cruelty, but also without hesitation, the way you state a fact you have been deciding for a long time. She said I had spent 7 years building nothing and expecting her to be impressed by it. She said she had finally stopped waiting. She extended her hand toward Marcus, and he crossed the floor to stand beside her, and the room understood what it was watching in the particular way crowds understand things, all at once and irreversibly. She kept her eyes on mine as she spoke. I think she expected something, a reaction, a break in composure, some visible evidence of impact. I looked at her steadily and gave her nothing. Marcus took the microphone from her and addressed me directly. His voice was measured, assured, the voice of a man who has never once stood in a room and felt uncertain of his welcome. He told me that the evening was for people who had built something, and that I should leave with whatever dignity remained available. The security guard appeared at my side moments later. I set down my glass. I straightened my jacket, and I walked toward the door. I was 12 steps from the exit when Evelyn's voice came through the room's sound system, not through a handheld microphone. Through the venue's main speaker infrastructure, the kind of broadcast that reaches every corner of a space simultaneously and from which there is no natural place to look away. Evelyn had been standing at the venue's audio management station since 30 minutes before the event began. This was the arrangement I had made with Daniel and with the venue's technical director, a man named Paul who had been managing the property since I acquired it and who understood, with complete professionalism, who gave the instructions in this building. Evelyn said simply that there was a matter of corporate record that the room deserved to be aware of before the evening's program continued. The room went very quiet. She said that Carvel Group had been operating under a holding structure since its founding. She said the name of that structure. She said that the controlling interest in Carvel Group, the majority stake, the founding position that had been the financial backbone of everything being celebrated that evening, had never changed hands. She said that the man who had just been asked to leave was the sole authority over that holding. And then she said my full name, my complete name, the name I had not used in any room connected to Carvel Group in 11 years, and the understanding moved through 300 people like something physical. I stopped walking. I turned around. The board members in the front section of the room were standing, not in coordination, not as a gesture, simply because sitting had stopped feeling right. The 3 senior executives who had served longest at the company were looking at me with expressions that contained several things at once: recognition, recalibration, something that in other circumstances might have been embarrassment. Serena was still on the stage. The microphone was in her hand, and she was not speaking. Marcus was beside her, and he was not speaking. The room was not speaking. 300 people who had watched a man be walked to the door were now watching that same man stand in the middle of their understanding of everything that had just happened, and they were working very quickly to assemble a new version of events that accommodated what they had just been told. Daniel entered from the side corridor. He crossed the room with the unhurried directness of a man who has never once confused urgency with haste. He stopped in front of Marcus and addressed him by name. He referenced, in a voice pitched precisely to be heard by the surrounding tables, the consulting entity, the redirected budget approvals, the communication that had been recovered during the server migration. He named the private equity group and the 2-year timeline of quiet inquiry. He said that federal wire fraud statutes were specific about the mechanisms Marcus had used and that the documentation supporting every element of the case had been preserved and verified. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Then he said it was an internal accounting matter. Daniel looked at him with the expression of a man who has spent 13 years listening to inadequate responses and has stopped being surprised by them. He said that it was no longer internal. The people standing closest to Marcus moved away. Not conspicuously, not in unison, but the distance between them and him grew in the way that distances grow between people and things that have begun to smell of consequence. I walked back through the room and onto the stage. I didn't take the microphone immediately. I stood for a moment and looked at Serena. She was still holding the microphone, and she was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 7 years of marriage. Not the confident composure she wore in professional rooms, not the open warmth she could produce at will, not even the quiet distance of the last difficult year. She was looking at me with the expression of someone who has just understood something too late and knows with complete clarity that the understanding itself is the punishment. I took the microphone gently from her hand. She did not resist. I said 3 things. The first was about the employees in the room, the people who had built Carvel Group with their actual labor, who had given years to the work because they believed in it. I told them their positions were secure. I told them the company's direction would not change. I told them that whatever had happened that evening between 3 people on a stage had nothing to do with the work they had done or the work that remained. The second was about Marcus. I said that a man who uses proximity to access what he cannot earn through legitimate means will always eventually encounter the structure he thought he was circumventing. I said I hoped the process that followed was instructive. The third thing was harder to say, and I said it anyway, quietly enough that only Serena could fully hear it over the ambient stillness of the room. I told her I had never hidden my identity to test her. I had hidden it because I had needed to know that what we were building was real before I brought everything else into it. I told her that the version of me she had decided wasn't worth staying for had been the most honest version I had ever offered anyone. And I told her that I was sorry, not for who I was, but that the person she had chosen to leave with had never once been interested in her as anything other than an instrument. I wanted her to know that, because I thought it mattered, and because I was no longer the man who kept things quiet when saying them might protect someone from a truth they needed. She didn't answer. I didn't wait. The months that followed were clean in the way that things are clean when the disorder has finally been acknowledged and the process of setting it right can begin. Daniel moved the case forward with the methodical precision that had made him the only attorney I had ever fully trusted. The documentation was thorough, the cooperation of the external investigators was prompt, and Marcus's careful financial architecture, which had appeared sophisticated from certain angles, proved considerably less durable once the correct people began applying direct pressure to its foundations. The entity was dissolved. The accounts were frozen. The redirected funds were recovered through civil process and deposited back into the structures from which they had been taken. 2 board members who had been aware of Marcus's informal inquiries without formally disclosing them resigned. The departures were handled without public statement, which was appropriate. They had been complicit through inattention rather than design, and the distinction mattered to how I chose to respond. Serena submitted her firm's resignation from the Carvel Group communications portfolio within the week. It was the right decision, and I respected her for making it without being asked. She sent a letter through her attorney 3 months later. 4 pages, handwritten. She wrote about the year before the gala with an honesty I had not expected and did not take for granted. She wrote that she had not stopped loving me, but that she had started measuring love against the wrong things, and that by the time she understood the difference, she had already made herself impossible to take back. I read the letter twice. Then I placed it in a drawer at the estate and did not respond. Not as punishment. There was nothing left to negotiate, and writing back would have suggested otherwise. Some doors close not because anyone slams them, but simply because both people have, at last, stopped holding them open. The Aldrin Terrace was refurbished the following spring. Better acoustics, better lighting along the interior corridor, a small structural change to the rooftop terrace that the original design had not fully resolved. I reviewed the plans myself and approved them on a Thursday morning over coffee, in an office that looked out over the city. Evelyn brought the final documentation to my desk that afternoon. She set it down without ceremony, the way she had always set documents down, with the settled confidence of someone who understood that the work itself was the point. I signed where it indicated and handed it back. She asked if there was anything else. I told her no. I told her the day had been enough. She nodded and went back to her desk in the adjoining room, and the office was quiet in the way offices are quiet at the end of something that has taken longer than it should have to resolve itself and is now, finally, simply done. Through the window, the city moved on in the ordinary way cities move on, indifferent to the specific weight of any particular evening, carrying forward the 10,000 small stories that run beneath the visible surface of every room, every building, every gala where someone has been asked to leave before anyone understood who they were asking. I had never needed the room to know. I had only needed to know myself, and in the end, that had been enough.